It's with our great pleasure to have Mr. Michael Etherington with us today. Michael is a friend of ours. We first met Michael when March of 2018, and you were so inspiring, we thought, man, we need to have Michael back. This is the end of our convention, and I don't think there's any way of ending it with you. Thank you so much for coming. Michael Etherington, everyone.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to receive an invitation back to share a message, but also from the colleagues here as well. Mike reached out to me initially, invited me back, and so he did mention, he said, a few of you liked my story, so I was thinking to myself, some time has passed, so I got a few new stories to share. With that being said, it sounds like you had an excellent few days, and so my role here too as well was to continue about what I can contribute, but also a message for the work that's being done as a community, but more specifically with who I am, is our collaborative efforts as Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. So I took time to reflect about what the message I would like to share and contribute, and coincidentally, I messaged Mike and I said, the theme I'd like to talk about is finding our voice and finding our story. And in Canada right now, we're currently in this era of truth and reconciliation, and so I thought what I would like to contribute is about the voice and story that we share as individuals, but also as a community, because when I initially shared the talk with you, it was informative in nature, but the next thing is about, well, what happens once you start having relationships presence, and how do you keep relationships sustainable? And I thought where we are as a country, but more importantly as a community, I find that's one of the fundamental challenges that we share. So just to give you a background and insight, I was working with organizations for a period of time, but in the past year, I've been invited onto also international stages. I was actually in Europe, and I was in Scotland, and I was actually in Australia at 2 different events. But why I'm sharing that to you is actually in reconciliation in Canada about the message we shared. The key word I like to attribute in your work, in your roles, is the word belief. So what I mean by that, for the belief in the work and advocacy that you're doing, when you're speaking to groups who don't have a context, who don't have an understanding about what your role is, it's not going to resonate with them. But when you reach out to people, when you have a voice and you have a platform beside you, how do you ensure that you're speaking on their behalf, but knowing what you represent? So why I'm sharing that with you, for example, when I was in Scotland, these individuals approached me from Ireland, and they said, have you heard of the Good Friday Agreement? And I said, I don't know too extensively history, but I'm quite familiar. And he said, well, what you just shared would be very relevant for you to speak in Scotland with regards to peace building. Now, when I went to Australia, there was an actually coincidental thing. It had nothing to do with the work. It actually just had to do with the narratives I heard around as a community. So when I was in Australia, a lot of people asked me, they said, oh, I could tell you have an accent, you're not from here. And they said, where are you from, mate? And I said, well, I'm from Canada. And they said, oh, that's good. Well, are you here for work? I said, well, I'm at a conference. And they said, I'm working with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous, never heard of that. I think in Australia you refer to them as Aboriginals, Aborigines, but it was the word that they shared that goes, oh, them. So I did not entertain anything after that because I knew there's probably going to be a follow-up. So, but in the community dynamic, I noticed there was a lot of reservations and thoughts, and that has to do with dialogues I had between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. But one group I want to just share with you next door is the Maori. So in New Zealand, the Maori reached out to me when I was there speaking, and one thing I thought was kind of an overlooked process for a lot of us today is what I found quite interesting in my travels around Canada, but also and abroad as well, was a lot of Indigenous peoples, they have a lot of cultural context around greetings. So what I mean by that, the formation of how you greet each other is an important process. But for a lot of us here, if you look in the contemporary politics of today, I'm not into partisan politics, but how many of you see this type of gesturing? I'm not going to name the individual, but you know who he is. And as a result, you could tell that's there's a power dynamic going on about how you're engaging. But a lot of the communities I've met recently, like I showed you the handshake, and the best thing was, though, actually, when I met Mike and the group here, they remembered what I showed them. And for those of you who may not, we just saw each other, and we just did this, and he says, "Oh, it's good to see you." And that's a continuation of cultural context, but what I'm trying to attribute and highlight, that's just a gesture of respect. And as a result of that gesturing, it's a continuation of a relationship moving forward. And so why I'm sharing that with us, for us to consider as a group and as a union body, a lot of times those gesturings don't take place in a space where your cultural context is understood. It's more about the convenience of who's dictating the conversation. But then when that happens, when you move forward in a relationship, that tells you that's how you address inequities. So in this era of truth and reconciliation, I'm sure many of you have seen a news clipping very recently. A reporter asked NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, did anyone see anything about clean drinking water? So I just want to bring that forth because that was in contemporary news. And he was asked, he said, "So are you going to write a blank check for all Indigenous peoples?" And that was a genuine question that they asked, because a lot of times it gets down to boiling down the economical narrative, etc. But what was interesting, though, I don't have any political affiliation to any party, but I just want to bring it forth for consideration, as I liked his response. He says, what if Toronto didn't have clean drinking water? What if Ottawa or what if Montreal didn't have clean drinking water? But what was kind of interesting, though, the reporter deviated from just responding and tried to prompt back to the question. So what was he trying to do is actually establish his insight to what he thought about the narrative. And I thought that's kind of where we are as a country today, is that when we talk about accountability, transparency, we take ourselves out of having an active role. And to distill it down to a community narrative, you see this pin I have here? It's, for those of you in the back, you might not be able to see, but there's some ribbons and there's a sweetgrass braid here. And I was there very recently in Manitoulin Island, and I had a t-shirt on it that says Wingush Film Festival. And I was wearing this as well. And Mike mentioned I talked about my cousin in the Tim Hortons, and actually this is I see a lot of you drinking Tim Hortons, and this actually has to do with someone I met in Tim Hortons that's non-Indigenous. And he was a senior, and he was sitting there eating a sandwich like this. He was eating, and he just sees me walking with the t-shirt and this, and he's like, and I could tell he wants to ask me something, and he just genuinely asked me. He says, this is a big lineup, by the way. I'm like probably one of 5, and I'm in the middle. And he says, "Hey, you, what's that mean? What's this mean?" And he's, "What's that?" And he's asking a bunch of questions. But everyone else is looking to see if I would be offended. And no, I'm not that type of person. I don't get overly. But I shared to him. I said, "Well, this is a sweetgrass braid, and Wingush means sweetgrass in the language." And he said, "Oh, okay." And I thought that'd be it, but there was more follow-up questions. So what do you do? And while I was sitting in the ordering, I got my coffee, and then after that, I asked him. I said, "Well, I got my coffee now. Is it okay if I sit down and share a conversation with you?" And he was surprised by that. He thought this would just be a response about what he asked, and that was it. But I looked at the person, and I saw a genuine interest. He actually wanted to inquire. And so I had my coffee with him, and after when the coffee's done, but then we start talking just about life in general. And he told me that I've been a retiree since 1989. And he said, as a result, he said, I've never met an Indigenous person in my life. He said, you're actually probably one of the first Indigenous peoples I ever spoke to. And he was actually just generally interested about this conversation. And he never heard anything, had to do anything with reconciliation. But what was interesting about that is I'm currently writing a book right now. It's going to be published next summer. So what the initial title was, when I started off, it was called Finding Your Voice, Finding Your Story in the Era of Truth and Reconciliation. And I thought I'm proud of that title. But then I saw the way the politics and everything's moving forward, and that his name was Bruce. And the way Bruce responded made me reflect upon what I wanted to contribute, because as a result, he's just a community member. He's not a politician. He's not part of this the institution. He's just someone living day to day. So then when I thought about that, in 2018, in contemporary news, how many of you remember an NDP in the House of Commons, what he asked the Prime Minister regarding pipelines? Did anyone hear about that story? So what he said in the House of Commons, he said, it sounds like you're having a very fruitful, invested relationship to Indigenous peoples, and talk about pipelines. But this is bold. I'm going to be candid here, but this is the question that he asked. He says, why doesn't the Prime Minister go and tell the truth and say he does not give a fuck about Indigenous rights? And a lot of people did this. And it created shock. And what was important about that, they didn't care about the message he asked. The House Speaker said, we know the NDP representative is a long-term standing member of this House. Can he retract his use of language? And so they called it unparliamentary language. So then he had to say, he apologized. But then that resonated to where we are in this climate today, is because between all of us as Canadians, Premier Ford was recently again, I'm not conservative, liberal, etc. But first, when he was firstly elected, during even the time in passing here, he dropped the Indigenous education portfolio as his first priority. And then also recently too, Bill C-262 was dropped under the United Nations Declaration. But two senators and our two members of the House, when they rejected the bill, they high-fived each other. And they sat down. But what happened was they got public backlash, and they said, well, we weren't high-fiving because of that. We were just high-fiving because there was not enough time, and we had another meeting to go towards. And so I'm just sitting there like this. But I thought to myself, where we are today in this conversation, you have factions. So those factions in their professional area, they have a legal responsibility, and they have a legal narrative to theirs. But the most important thing is they just genuinely don't care about this conversation. So for example, when you talk about the clean drinking water, there's still 56 open active cases in the country. But what I want to share for this here is someone like the individual Bruce is doing a call out to us as a community, but actually asking ourselves, well, what do we stand for and represent? And so I actually wanted to read a poem for you. And it has to talk about an individual. He was the steering member of Reconciliation, and I want to see if anyone knows this individual. It's a poem called Invictus. Has anyone heard the poem Invictus before? It says, out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody, but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years shall me find unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And if you aren't familiar with the reference of that poem, it has been historically referenced by a lot of individuals who advocated and tried to change circumstance. But the only reason I'm sharing that with you is because an individual, Nelson Mandela, was sharing that when he was incarcerated for X amount of years. And he actually was able to recite that poem by memory because it had to do with his circumstance, but also being able to stand for something he truly believed in. And across the country and across the world, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have been implemented in countries. But I want to use South Africa as a cautionary tale. Because where we are at, us and you as a group, I thought it was quite interesting, is that you're at your 50th year anniversary, and we acknowledge our milestones and our successes. But once you start being defined by your success of what's attributed, then what else do we stand for? What else do you want to move the conversation and make it sustainable? Because why I'm sharing that with you, it's a conversation of leadership. If you are not familiar with South Africa, what happened in South Africa when the ANC and the group started elevating reconciliation, it was being achieved, but then the leadership capability started to diminish. And now today you're starting to actually see acts of genocide continue in South Africa. But the biggest challenge of it, if you're not familiar, is South Africa now is being impacted by clean drinking water. They're starting to have a freshwater crisis. And one of the biggest narratives that we share in this country, what is it about our relationship that we build to each other? So is it a message of convenience and opportunity, or is it a message that I like to share for you about how do you make it sustainable so that you stand by each other? So the biggest call to action that I can share to you is that where we are at today is that we have met plenty of policies, plenty of recommendations, but this narrative I'd like to talk about is the narrative of our own humanity. And so for us in our work, in our advocacy, that may or may not resonate us, but it has to be something that we stand for. So with the invitation when I was brought forth here, people do reference motivation and people do reference speaking, but if you come from an Indigenous perspective, you won't see too many going, yes. To me, it's great, but I find it's too disingenuous because I don't act like that every day. But I can bring forth my authentic way of my spirit. And I think that's one of the biggest qualities I found with Indigenous communities is still being genuine to oneself. And there's a question I'm going to pose to you. And coincidentally, I don't know if it's just how the semantics worked out, but you're all sitting in threes. And actually, I talked to Michael about this, about acknowledging our milestones. But what I want to bring forth is Inuk elder I've met in the north in the Arctic. Has anyone been to the Arctic before? Whereabouts? Tuktoyaktuk. My dad actually was up there just recently. Yeah. Fort Good Hope. And then I saw one more hand. Northern Yukon. Warm, eh? Just kidding. So one thing, if you've been? Baker Lake. And one thing I'm going to share the narrative of this, but for a lot of us, every time I meet someone, you must hear this a lot. How many times have you heard, just as community members, a lot of people say we're proud to be Canadian? And the reason I always mention this geographical reference, I asked someone in Toronto, are you proud to be Canadian? They're like, yes. Where in Canada been? Niagara Falls. And I'm like, that's great. Anything further? I've been to Mississauga. Anything beyond that? Have not been outside the province of Ontario. And I always try to make this narrative a lot smaller in terms of what we represent country, but because our biggest paradigm is that out of sight, out of mind. And this elder, Mariana Opiogic, I'm not going to go to the details of it, but what he showed me was 3 rocks when I first met him, and he only spoke in Nuktatuk. And when he showed me these 3 rocks, he asked me about what he thought these represent. And I just said to him, I said, I'm not too sure. Are you talking about the Indigenous knowledge? And he goes, yes. And he asked me, he said, you know when I told you about these rocks? I said, yes. He said, you said Indigenous knowledge. I said, yes. But he said, when you look at these rocks, they just represent what you would visualize them as a symbolic meaning. And he said the core of it has to do with your past, your present, and your future. So the way these rocks visually looked, the past one was a large piece of granite soapstone. It looked very round. The middle was very jagged and beat up. And the third one was kind of round, but not as perfect in the circumference as the third. But he said to me, he said, in your growth and development, he said, you'll find something that represents your past, something symbolic, something for your present, and something for your future. Now, he said it might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, it might be years from now. You may find something of that. But when you meet us as a community, for example, especially as a country, I would say the first 2 are completely devoid in absence of us in our considerations. For example, our past and present. If we have you and I standing here and we're discussing and sharing things together, you might not have a context understanding of what I represent. So for example, when I say about treaties, did you notice when I said treaty, I just in my body language stood up, because it's something I'm proud of. It's something that I stand by. But for many of us here who don't have that context of understanding, if you talk about treaties and land rights, you say, oh, that's cute. What is that, a piece of paper? Or you think it's something ideological or historical. But it's a principle that binds us in a relationship. So one thing I just want to ask you as a group, talk amongst your colleagues. I don't want to make this about Canada. Actually, I want to talk about your organization. So I'll give you an example of what I'm trying to reference in the segue for here, is because each of us in an organization, we have an affiliation about what binds us. So if you and I work together, we are bound by a vision and principle that's beyond us, that keeps us as a collective together. People talk about vision statements, your mission, but what are your priorities or your strategic priorities? And I can tell you in my role, when I ask companies this, I get so many blank faces. For example, who here can share word for word your vision and mission of the organization? I'll wait. I was kidding. A lot of people get their phones out for Google, but why I'm sharing that for you, how it's going to go into the conversation, it's principles. So if we're shaking each other's hand, and I say, well, this is a friendship based upon respect, and we don't understand what that means, we're not going to be able to walk together because we're going to have misunderstanding. But one thing I want to ask you, just talk amongst your colleagues, think about your past, present, and future for a few moments, but what are the milestones that you have? And just name one each. What is the milestones that you have achieved in your past, your present, but more importantly, after today? So just take a few moments, talk for your group, and I'll bring your attention back to the front. So go ahead. You have your success stories of what you tried to publicate and get the narratives out. Now, think about how many of you consider in your professional area that you're quite clear. It sounds like you had a dialogue of understanding that. But if you think about, for example, the Indigenous community, you don't hear those success stories. So when you look at when I said your past, present, and future, a lot of times in our representation is that when you look at our narrative that you see today, I always tell groups, especially in our media representation, the only time you see Indigenous peoples is they call it the 3Ds, if they're dead, drunk, or dancing. That's usually predominantly the only time you see them in vocally in aspects. And why I share that with you is because when you bring forth a message of strength and attribute it, there are certain realities. But for someone like myself, I'm not defined by the reality of the injustice, but I'm quite well aware. So for example, when I shared to you about our consideration of the social issues, the inequities impacting Indigenous peoples, it is a reality. But what's happening today is that through the emergence of this, we still will have continual resistance. So when we reference about, when you talk about standing for here, what's happening, and I think in our narrative that we see as an organization and union or et cetera, is that where we're moving towards is devoid of any political interventions or political influence, but it's a necessity to work with them. So how do we bridge accountability? Is if you think about in Canada right now, the current statistical representation of Indigenous peoples is about 5% of the country. Now, I'm sure, how many of you are familiar with Thunder Bay, with the current issues that are going on in Thunder Bay? Just to give you an example, when I was in Thunder Bay, I was hired by two companies, the LCBO and the Thunder Bay Police Services. Why I'm referencing the Thunder Bay Police Services and the LCBO is because if you look at some of the stuff, what's the biggest stereotype of Indigenous peoples? Drinking. And they're a part of the institution that sells, consumes, barters, sells alcohol. Now, one thing when I talk about past, present, future, I just want to use their organization as an example. I did some background research into the LCBO. So around 1927, in Ontario, we started doing our legislation from addressing prohibitions and moving forward. But how many of you heard of this? It's called an interdiction list. So around the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the LCBO had It was called the interdiction list about who is in what they would call meritable status to consume and drink alcohol. And then as time passed around the 60s and 70s, it started gaining traction for a new name. It was called the Indian list. Because if you think about the prevalence rates of it, the largest margins of marital status for drinking was Indigenous peoples. Why I'm sharing that with you is that if you think about the misconceptions of Indigenous peoples, when you talk about what we stand for and represent, there are stereotypes perpetuating the realities about how we relate to one another. But why I'm sharing this example for you, that's a manufactured stereotype. Why? Think of this. Why in public conscious thought across Canada would you have the reference of Indigenous peoples being labeled as such? It's to induce and shift any relationships being forward from community members. So where I'm sharing that to you, I asked the management there, I said, how many of you are aware, put on speaker, I was kidding.
Okay, out in the hallway for 5 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. You're on the interdiction list. No, I was kidding. So anyways, when you look at that narrative, I asked the management, I said, how many of you actually know this? Not one person knew that, and that was the management of the organization. So they didn't know the historical narrative. But as a result, when I did the sessions with the staff, you should have seen the opposition from the onset. One, think of this. You work for an institution, you know it perpetuates the #1 stereotype against Indigenous peoples, and then you find through professional development, we're going to be inviting an Indigenous trainer. They're probably going to be nervous, and they're thinking, well, what's he going to say? How is he going to deal or discuss this narrative? So I walk in. Every single table, there's about 60 per session. Every single person looked like this. Because they already had natural resistance. And then I come in, I just say, hello, good morning. He's not aggressive. And I start talking and sharing stories. Well, he's not that bad. so I just started chipping away, and I just started making the space comfortable. But when I left, I got a bunch of emails from staff, but there was just, I'm going to quote this one individual. He did say, Michael, when I came in, I had every negative view of Indigenous people. I was just dead set on it. But in the conversation about everything you presented, I actually changed my view. And he said, I truly cannot thank you for that. And I lived in Thunder Bay for X amount of years. And right now, it is so politically and polarized and divided. I stress this enough. Now, what's happening today, people are exploiting that narrative, both from Indigenous, non-Indigenous. And secondarily, this is not a binary conversation. It's not between Indigenous, non-Indigenous, because each group has a multitude of subcultures. So what's important for that to consider is that even when you look at the narrative of these politics that are in these political grandstands ongoing, is that how we relate to each other, there's a huge influence of these systems at play in about how we relate to one another. I'll give you an example. That same time I was there, I had not a trench coat, but I had a rain jacket, this suit, and I had a tie, sunglasses, and you know those wireless earbuds? Think of this. I had sunglasses, this blue suit, a tie, a jacket there, and I'm walking around just to get a coffee. What do I look like? Yeah, I look like a police officer. And so I was walking there, and I'm just I was listening to good music. I'm like, doo 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 doo. And then I can see someone approaching me. It's an Indigenous woman. And when she's approaching me, she goes, hey, you, stop right there. Stop right there. And she gets her phone out. And she starts recording me. And then she says, what are you doing here? I'm like, I'm here for work. She's like, no, I'm not letting you pass. And I took my glasses off, took my earbuds. I said, just so you know, I'm Cree. And she goes, oh, shit. Then starts apologizing. But why I'm sharing that just on her, she by just observation of me as an individual, she attributed me as part of that political narrative as the quote-unquote enemy. She thought I was an officer of those relationships. So I'm sharing that then as well. The identity politics that we're seeing today, it has nothing to do with who you are as a person. I can attribute what I can label to you about what I assume you to be. And that's the way we're defining our relationship today. So when you think about these aspects, about the principles behind about how we move forward together, when I talk about my role and voice and platform, it is nothing grandiose about what I do in community. There's no grandstanding. There's no subtleties. I go to communities, and if you meet elders, they're them like really relaxed individuals. Sometimes when I go there, if I'm going to an organization, they don't say and do these big spiels. They say, hey, all right, get to work. Nice to see you. And what is it about that would be representative of this narrative? And so in my book, what I want to share was a few examples about how these political grandstandings are impacting the relationships. But if you think about it, if I say something to you saying, I'm the Indigenous speaker, but well, I do believe that I'm a speaker who happens to be Indigenous because I'm proud of my culture and proud of my traditions, but I don't want it to be defining about how we relate to one another. So, but the most important factor of it, what do I advocate and represent? So when you think about where our roots lie in our traditions today, I found quite interesting though is when I work with companies, especially executives, first thing I see is just that body language. So can I shake your hand? Just the firm. How many see a firm handshake? Like, it's nice to meet you. And then you squeeze harder. I hope we have a good coffee today. So you can see just the ego growing and growing. So, but when I come in and I shake someone's hand, it's just like a really soft, just a general soft, kind handshake, and it throws leaders off. It actually, when I work with CEOs, they see me flinch sometimes, like, they're like, oh, geez, you don't have a firm handshake. But when you think about that, that's a cultural context. Where in our in your roots and ideology became that as a sign of indicative leadership? I actually had a conversation about this. Before even a relationship moved forward, how many of you heard this before? A firm handshake is a sign of a strong leader. How many heard that? If I go to in a community and I shake an elder's hand, I always found this quite interesting. It's just like it feels like air, like it's so soft and kind. But when you think about how they relate to each other and the principles of that. So one of the aspects, a word I would share for you in about one of my chapters is called the Tapachimon. So when I say about Tapachimon, what that means in Cree, it's about sharing your story. But how your story is shared, I think, is one of the most fundamental aspects that we have in our own growth and development. And so for us in our communities as individuals and collective groups, we all have a narrative and we all have a story. But what I find today is our stories are being told, but also secondarily, we're telling stories that are not even our own. So when you think about someone like myself, if you look at me and you said, this is an Indigenous representative, I can share every example about my secondhand experience about communities, etc., inequities, challenges. I come from no clean drinking water, seeing all the crises imaginable. But what is it that keeps you going? So for example, you as a union, you address some challenges, but even if you think about someone like myself, I go to communities and I see despair, like you can feel it. Have you ever been in a space and you could just feel the negative energy? And it's like a tension. So imagine when you go to a community and you start sharing and you start doing this. You're not going to connect with people right away. They're going to do what they'll say up north. Oh, this guy thinks he's good. That's a northern expression. And then right away, I lost them. So when I go to communities that are in a certain position, how do you uplift the community? And when I went back home, I think this is actually post last time I seen you as a group, I started getting a lot of calls from where I'm from, up north. And people said, we've been watching you. was like, that doesn't sound good, but go ahead. Sounds like I did something bad, right? We've been watching you. I'm just using an Indian Act reference, but anyways. When I go up north, the communities asked me, they said, we want you to speak to the young people, the children and youth. And the children and youth, when I went up north, I always make reference to these languages. Our body languages I see is this. I've met people in my work, just having conversations. And when I talk to a lot of community members, I always see that so often. How's your day? Good. What do you have planned later? Not much. Just blip, 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 blip. Now, I can't diagnose or assess where people are, but you can develop an insight into where they stand. But when I was speaking to these children and youth, they did this. They do that. So they sat down like this. This is how they actually sit, like, if you work with youth like this. I sat like that too before, but you know they sit like this. Too cool for school kind of thing. So, but when I was listening, I could tell they were connected, and they do this. So they're trying to act, I'm not really that interested, but I'm listening. So after that, they asked me a question. They asked me, what advice for success would you give us? So I thought about what I can offer to these students, because if you talk about remote Indigenous communities, if you're saying, oh, here's a basketball, play some sports and do better, but they don't have clean drinking water, that's patronizing. Like here, you're trying to motivate yourself, but they don't have infrastructure. So there's a big pair. So I thought, what could it be realistic for someone to change the narrative? And I thought to myself, something practical I've done for myself, my grandparents always showed me, is I come from a family that is very strongly embedded in hunting traditions. So I'm going moose hunting next week with my uncle and my dad. So, hey, just kidding. just practicing. Just kidding. So when I go back up north, the principles of that I find very applicable, because a lot of these narratives we see is through observation. So for example, when you talk about the natural law of the communities who still have strong hunting traditions, I noticed my grandfather always got up when he heard this. How many of you heard that bird? It's like a morning bird. And do you know how early that, so if, not many hands went up, so I'm guessing you get up past 6 a.m.? Just kidding. These are the early, I don't know who the early risers, like, oh, I heard that bird. But that bird is actually even starts chirping before even the sun really rises. But when you look at it, my grandfather asked me, do you know when to stop your work? I said, I don't know, just when I'm tired. He says, when he talks about the time during the evening, what do you hear during the evening? You hear bugs like crickets, things like that. Now, he called those signs. He said, these are things that we can be attuned to develop our understanding principle. Because during that time, one thing, he was so meticulous. And what I'm trying to break a stereotype is the lazy Indigenous person. That's what I'm trying to address. My grandfather used to get up, make his bed, go there, make a cup of tea, and he'd just stand there and he'd look out the window and I used to talk to him. Imagine this, how many of you talk to your family and have a thorough conversation at 5 a.m.? Not many of us do. But when you have generations who still, I call it the old ways, it's called Waskich de Bachimon. It's old traditions and stories are shared. And I thought that, and I applied that to these young people. So I thought about my grandfather, and I thought, the knowledge is already in this community. It's just untapped. So the resources are already there. And so I told the children, I said, how many of you made your bed this morning? And I said, raise your hand. About 70% of the students said they did not make their bed. I said, well, forget the students, now teachers. And the teachers were like this, yeah, you tell those kids. When I asked the teachers, they're like, I said, don't, just be honest, every teacher. They said, I didn't make my bed. So I said, I'm not going to tell anything about starting a business. I'm not going to say anything about a job or a career or sport. You need something that is incremental about how you can build and move forward. And so I said to these students, I said to these kids, I said, you're trying to change the world, and how can you change the world if your personal affairs are out of sync? And that's a transparency to yourself. So I said, why don't you start with something simplistic by just making your bed? So I fly back to Toronto. So I just left that message, and I came back here to do my work. My email came up, bling, bling, bling. I was thinking, I looked at it, and they said, ever since you left, the principals and teachers have been getting bombarded by parents. They said, what the hell did you do there? I wish I could show you some of the email on the screen, but these are examples. They said, whatever happened during that time, grandparents and parents have been asking their children, how come you're making your bed? They said, we've had children and youth in our families never made their bed a day in their life, and all of a sudden they're starting to develop, they noticed the routine change. And a grandfather asked one of these childs where I'm from, they said, how come you're doing it? And the child says, well, grandfather, if you make your bed, you're doing something right each day. What that was, it's nothing complex. It planted a seed. And that seed that was planted was creating change even where I come from in my community. Now, when you think about those aspects, about these cultural contexts that you see here, for many of us as Canadians, let's say categorically non-Indigenous, that could be already a life skill that's been promoted from day one. But for someone like myself, who's I'd say a community member, I don't like accolades or titles attributed to myself. But when you think about someone, for me, I had to forge a path. For example, when I was growing up as a child, I just want to give you a personal source, this is not training. My first memory as a child was this. I used to hear, run, run, run. And I used to hear glass breaking. And I asked my mom, I said, you remember that time, this experience? It was embedded in my memory. And she was doing dishes, and she says, you remember that? I said, how old was I? I thought I was like 4 or 5. And she's like, you're a toddler. You're about 1.5 years. What it was actually when I was a child, community members, my own family members, and also distant relatives were coming to party and drink where my mom was staying. And they started busting windows and going in. And then as a result, over time, my mom had to leave the community. So prior to the age of 18, I lived in 15 different homes. Not by choice. It was called native housing, subsidized housing. So when you transition from the reserve to the remote area. But why I'm sharing that to you is that when you look at your story could be exploited. So if you look at someone like myself, you could say, that sounds like a little bit of vulnerability or a little bit of at-risk notions. I can go on and on with social issues, but that's not what I want to share with you. It's about those things of the process of being able to let it go, but by being not naive to not acknowledge it or ignore it. So to do the work that I do today, to work with communities of sharing a message of hope and resiliency, the first thing, the most important process was actually starting with myself. But who I want to share as part of the message is the key word of this conversation to have really strong success is the need for mentors. So who was my mentor? It was my mother. That's actually she's the rock to who I am today. But what I found quite interesting about my mother's story is my mother's story. But what's important, what I want to share for you, is she never acted like a victim. I found that really insightful. But every time I talked about experiences as I got older, things started coming up and sharing and disclosing. But I found that she was very meticulous in how she brought that narrative forth. So she's got her, just so you know, when she left, got her PhD, and then also my stepfather is one of the most successful criminal lawyers in Canada. So for those of you that were in the north, they're in Yellowknife currently, and now think of the ripple effect. What does that do for someone like me? I can observe and see that change, but if you're working with community members who don't see that, and you try to tell them to create change for yourself, they have no platform for that. They don't have any point of reference. So the paradigm that we see as a community, especially for uplifting and moving forward, is that how do we recognize those stories, and more importantly, have those stories have had an opportunity or forum to be heard, to be acknowledged, but more importantly, to create change. So for a lot of us today, when you see those narratives and stories, when I go to community members, I just want to give you an example. When I see community members, I actually go down. Some of you might not be seeing, and if I'm downtown, I've done this last week. I saw a community member on the street, and I just sat there like this, and I said, "How's your day?" And this was an individual, the wheelchair, diabetic on dialysis, and just talked to them. Just got down to their level, not patronizing, not trying to insinuate anything. But the reason I'm sharing that for you, I don't glorify it. And more importantly, how do you recognize someone when you acknowledge your story but uplift them? So where we're currently at, what I find, what I would say is the prioritization. So the prioritization that we see of this country is that in 2019, we are moving forward in a manner that I find that those who are the most vulnerable are still being left behind. And every aspect and opportunity that I can contribute for those of us here is that we cannot ever forget them. So one of the biggest aspects that you see in your professional portfolios, when was the last time you've genuinely reached out to someone? So when you look about in our operations, how many of you live in Toronto? So if you're in Toronto, if you see someone vulnerable during rush hour, how many people you see stopping to help or support? Now, you don't even have to help them or assistance. The most important thing is just the recognition. So for someone like, if you see someone that's vulnerable in the streets, a lot of times they don't care about having money. They want a space to just be recognized, respected, and they just even to share a story. And so I would say for this call to action of this talk today is beyond the politics, beyond the grandstanding, is that I'm in high hopes that how we move the reconciliation narrative forward is that we take it into consideration that where we restore our humanity. Is because for my work today, I think where we're currently at is that we are losing that because reconciliation, I find, it's at a catharsis. They did the 94 calls to action. Politicians, bureaucrats, it's once you get into the monetary dialogues, for example, they say, oh, to address the infrastructure, clean drinking water. They're not going to address it. Why waste your words when you talk to someone in positions of power who don't even listen or address it? So why I'm sharing that to you, I'm long overdue that conversation. I'm way past that. The quote I shared with you with the prior group, I'd like to bring forward, because the quote I did share before, it says, to create change, to build a new model that makes the old model obsolete. So for those of us here, there's an old model that's just continuing and continuing. Why am I going to waste the opportune time spending the next 40 years talking to a body who's not going to address it? So for me, my call out is the group such as your union, the Confederation of Canadian Unions, other groups who can actually build momentum. Because if you look at social change and movements, it's the people that actually hold the government accountable. And so what's happening in I would say my recognition to us as a community, Indigenous peoples right now at their lower stage is that there's a smaller margin and they do not want us talking to each other. That's why there's no educational reform. That is why you don't see it. And the reason is the premise was wrong to begin with. They said they dropped the Indigenous education portfolio. And I thought, your premise is wrong. It's education, not Indigenous education. So our shared history, until that becomes interpreted, understood, and clear, then we can start somewhere to create a path together. And what I would close off for you as a group, when I made reference to it, there's a word in Cree, Wakdun, which means kinship. And so I think where we're currently at and moving forward as a country, there are so many community members today who stand and believe But right now, we are just getting a fraction apart. And the only thing I want to address is the identity politics. Don't allow the identity politics. Identity politics is good in certain aspects. Where it becomes an issue is when the priority of the group takes over the interest of us as a community. So for example, I'm impacted by identity politics. I can't escape it. Am I forever going to be the Indigenous Canadian? Am I forever going to be the status Indian? Or can we get to a point and say that we're Canadians, but Canadians who stand up for treaties, Canadians who stand up for human rights? For example, 2008, I was at a human rights conference 2 weeks ago, and I brought forth Romeo Saganash's quote about the Prime Minister not giving a fuck about Indigenous right, and all those union members stood up and applauded me. I said, sit down, do something. And they're like, oh shit. Reason being, I don't want to grandstand the conversation or sensation, because the other panelists were like, we're going to take them on, and everyone's getting riled up, and I was like, that's great, but that's episodic. You need a sustainable momentum. But more importantly, if you look at the human rights, there's one thing that's missing from when you talk about Indigenous peoples is basic human rights. Just so you know, when the Canadian human rights was established in 1977, you as an Indigenous person could not challenge the government until 2008. You as a group should be aware of this. It's called Section 67. Section 67 was not repealed until 2008, which was 11 years ago. So if you're an Indigenous person such as myself, I couldn't use the Canadian Human Rights Act as a legislative aspect to address discrimination. Think of that. So those are like little subtleties of undertones that are some of the realities, but many of us just simply don't know. So for us moving forward, when I said about the reconciliation, what I'm hoping today is that finding an identifiable pathway. So for my work, it's going to continue on. I stand and believe it, but I don't want to be like this kind of guy. Hey guys, reconciliation. No, I just want it to be like this. Again, where I said this, where we can not shake each other's hand all exactly, getting to that point instead of going like that. We got to take the ego out of it. We got to take the misrepresentation. We have to take out the disparities and also the binary aspect of this conversation. For example, we are still defined as Indigenous, non-Indigenous Canadians. You as a group, I can really create friction if I stood by this. Not a good way to close, but I'm not, this is not my views, by the way. I'm just saying it's a reality. What if I came in here and said this? You know, we got to address white privilege. You know, people stand by that, and they believe it's a concept of a reality. For example, Indigenous peoples are being indoctrinated into a sphere and circle because we're going through a cultural shift in North America. For example, how many of you heard the quote, sticks and stones? That's a root of what they call dignity culture and addressing adversities. Think of it, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. We're in a cultural shift. Today, what do people say? Words are hurtful, words are violent, and that actually creates momentum. But one thing I just want to address about some of the rhetoric and grandstanding today, I talked to young people about that, and every single student was like this. Sounds great, but when are you going to get people to address white privilege? I said, you believe that? Yeah. I said, well, what have you done to address it? I wrote a paper on it. I was like, oh, have you actually worked with people on it? So, for example, we talk about the notions of privilege and certain realities, class bases, all those exist. But the connotation I want to share with you, I do not believe in it. If you want my narrative on those concepts, because in the reconciliation identity politics, that's just one subtlety of an area that's preventing meaningful relationships from occurring. Think of it. If you talk about that concept, now people today are being demonized, dehumanized, depersonalized. Why would I advocate for peace and use the same oppressive notions for building relationships. People are not going to want to be engaging, but it's not going to be sustainable. So what I'm trying to address in my closing remark, it's important for us to be informed, but I do hope that we can rise up and challenge and get away from the politics of this conversation and speak to us as humanity. But more importantly, like that individual Bruce that I met, is just being able to sit down, have a coffee, and how's your day? That's all I got to say. All right, thank you. One thing I was going to say is, so I have this pin. I thought about the importance of your relationships. What I do hope, I'm actually going to take my pin off, and I want to gift it to Michael. So I do hope for future meetings, because this has traveled with me around the world recently, and I believe in the work that you do, because this is about building friendships. So I want to actually gift my pin for Michael to carry forward and represent for us as to know that us as community Indigenous peoples, we're still an active role and we're building friendships. So I want to thank you for that.
Well,
I'll wear this proudly. Very proud.
don't poke yourself. No. Michael, thank you so much for being here for this presentation. And on behalf of us, we'd like to give you a little parting gift.
Thank you.
And friendship. Thank you. Thank you so much. Nobody go anywhere.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.